Hi there, my name is Scott Phillips. I'm the president and founder of StarFish Medical. One of the things that we do at StarFish is we run a conference to inspire entrepreneurial companies. And we run it in both Vancouver and Toronto and invite expert speakers from all over North America with a particular emphasis on serial medtech entrepreneurs. And it occurred to me what we should really do is actually do one-on-one interviews with some of these people so we could bring you their insights. And I think you're going to really enjoy them. Steve is a real icon in the medical technology scene in Canada. He's had a couple of big exits for hundreds of millions of dollars to strategic companies. He started his career in an unusual way for entrepreneurs as a big corporate guy, and he's now on his third startup that I know of. I'm really fascinated to have a chance to talk to you, Steve.
It's good to be here, and I look forward to the interview.
Great. So you started your career in kind of an unusual way, but let's actually take it back to your childhood, growing up in Montreal, I believe. So was there any indication of your sort of entrepreneurial future when you grew up?
Yes. You know, going back to the age of 12, I came from a large Lebanese family, and one of my uncles was a superb entrepreneur. And a pioneer in his own field. And I was fascinated by what he was doing, and I would, even at the age of 12, pepper him with a lot of questions. And I decided at the ripe old age of 12 that one day I was going to replicate Uncle Ramsey's pioneering efforts in the medical field.
No kidding.
Yeah.
The medical, you already said it at 12?
Oh yeah, I knew medical was my stick, and the reason for that is that my father was an extremely ill person throughout his life. And it hurt me to death to see someone I love struggle through life. And it brought out the empathy in me and the desire to someday develop new technologies to help people like my father.
No kidding. That's amazing. Okay, so then when you went to school, you chose engineering, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And how did you choose that?
I chose that because my mother said that I was going to be an engineer, and I didn't want to disappoint her. At the time, I felt that engineering could be as good as anything else in getting into the industry. And as I did a little bit of research back then, I started to realize that certainly in the United States, a lot of the technical development team were engineers. So.
Right. Very interesting. So what was your career thought when you graduated from university?
Get into sales. Start to make some money. My Uncle Ramsey mentored me, and he said the best way for you to really develop yourself as a businessman is to work in the trenches, work with customers, to develop a process of listening to their needs and translating them into solutions. So I started that way, and I have no regrets about it.
So you went to engineering school, but even when you were studying engineering, you didn't really have an idea you'd do engineering per se. It was sort of a good background to be a sales guy. Correct.
I wanted to be a businessman. I wanted to be an entrepreneur. But back in those days, getting a technical base in your education didn't seem to be a bad idea.
Right. Remarkable. Now, you had a fairly meteoric rise through Smith & Nephews. Can you talk a little bit about that part of your career?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, the first 17 years of my business life was with Smith & Nephew. And, you know, it's kind of rare that you see somebody start a career and spend 17 years with one company. But interestingly, every 2 years, when I got restless, the company promoted me. And then all of a sudden, 5 promotions later, I was the CEO at the ripe age of 35. So
35?
Yeah, 35. So that certainly put hair on my chest and wisdom in my head, because to survive in a large multinational with all the politics and the competition certainly sharpened my skills as a business person.
So interesting. So any highlights of those years that were formative for you?
Yes, I think that what I discovered during my rise through the multinational ranks is that I wasn't afraid to challenge status quo.
Right.
I wasn't afraid to challenge a pricing strategy for a new product. And oddly enough, most of the time, I ended up being right. So perhaps that contributed to my rise to the top, the fact that when I did intervene and when I did challenge and when I did try to lead new thinking, it happened to be right most of the time.
That's remarkable. Now, was there an R&D aspect of Smith & Nephew?
Yes, not much, but I kind of led a I was in Montreal. At the time, I was VP of Sales and Marketing in Canada, but they asked me to lead a global team of R&D for advanced wound care.
Really?
And so that was my first taste of innovation and research and development and interacting with researchers and doctors and translating their unmet needs into true value propositions. And I really, really liked that process. And I decided then, and I think I was about 31, 32 at the time, that someday I wanted to do this.
Amazing.
On
now,
my
was
own.
this before Smith & Nephew went up against KCI?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Right. So that whole battle came after, because I know you were out of there.
Yes. But I was there for the major acquisition of Richards Medical out of Memphis. And certainly I was about 34 at the time and on this acquisition team buying a $1 billion plus business in the States. And that was really eye-opening and a tremendous learning experience at a young age.
That's remarkable, the kind of experience you can gain working.
Yeah.
The research that I've done shows that really successful entrepreneurs in medtech tend to have corporate careers.
Is that right?
Typically not becoming the CEO, but maybe getting to a product manager level or something, and then go branch out into successful entrepreneurship.
I have to tell you something interesting. So during I was involved in 5 acquisitions in the States when Smith & Nephew went on an acquisition binge in the 80s. And what I started to realize is that when I was negotiating and doing due diligence with the CEOs of the acquirees, I kind of really envied them to be in that situation and to be wanted by a multinational and to be at the receiving end of millions of dollars, recognition for the hard work and the vision that they demonstrated over the years. I said, I think I like this. I think I want to be on the other side someday.
That's interesting. That was really my next question. Because here you are, you're having a meteoric career, you're widely admired and respected.
Making good money.
Making good money, having good security. And what would compel you to go take a bunch of risk and jump into a startup where you have none of that?
Well, after 5 years as the CEO in Montreal, the company expected me to relocate to the head office in London. In the UK. And I had to make probably one of the toughest decisions in my life, which was, do I go and stay and follow the corporate path, which was going pretty well, or do I make a tough decision and start to become an entrepreneur, even though there was tons that I still needed to learn. And I made it. So I made the decision that this was an appropriate moment in time to make a pivotal change in my career.
So
I was 40 years old at the time.
Right, which is sort of, it's a great time. You've developed a lot of knowledge and experience and capability, maybe credibility with the big people who would be investing in an entrepreneurial venture. So let's talk a little bit about the CryoCath transition, how you got involved in that.
Well, it wasn't directly transitioning from Smith & Nephew to CryoCath because sometimes these great opportunities just are not sitting there at your doorstep.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
So I got into strategic planning with an entrepreneurial strategic planning company in Montreal called ISO Group.
Yeah.
And they were pharmaceutical strategic planning consultants, and they knew that I had a network in MedTech, which was a new up-and-coming field.
Yeah.
So we made a deal that I could use all their models.
Yeah.
They would train me to be a strategic planning person, and that I would give them 10% off the top.
Right.
So that worked really well, and I ended up getting first Canadian strategic planning mandates, then some in the States, and ultimately a global planning mandate for a medical device company out of Sweden.
Yes.
And at that time, 4 years into that, the partners came to me because all of a sudden I was making more money than the partners. Right. So they said, "Okay, Steve, we think you're ready to be a partner now."
Right. Yeah.
So coincidentally, right at that time, a headhunter from Boston approached me saying, "Steve, we like your background. There's a great new opportunity of a technology coming out of Harvard that's moving up to Montreal.
Yeah.
And they're looking for a CEO."
Yeah.
And that company called Cardiac Canada at that time,
right,
and which ended up being CryoCath,
yeah,
was another real tricky and difficult decision-making point in my time, because I was making more money than I could imagine as a strategic planning leader around the world. And now this startup, high risk, salary cut, but a chunk of the company faced me. So that was another really big, and then I had to, the only way I could muster up the courage to make this difficult decision is to go back to my thoughts about Uncle Ramsey.
Yeah, really?
When I was 12. Oh yeah,
that's remarkable.
He had a huge impact on my life.
Yeah.
To go back to my thoughts when we were acquiring Richards.
Yeah.
And I said, "Remember, Steve, you really wanted to be on the other side.
Yeah.
Here's your chance."
Okay. So you've had repeated times in your career when you come to the edge, and it's a
big
irreversible decision, and you've
jumped with my eyes closed, my fingers crossed, and my heart palpitating.
Yes. Yeah, that's remarkable.
Yeah, I have to tell you an interesting story. So I took the jump with CryoCath, and it was into cardiovascular, which I was new to. I was mostly in orthopedics and advanced wound care kind of guy. And 3 weeks into the new job, the big international conference in the States on electrophysiology, cardiac electrophysiology, was happening in Seattle. So I grabbed a prototype catheter, got on a plane, and flew to Seattle to seek a new life, a new venture. So I managed to corner 2 key opinion leaders, 2 Americans, with this new technology. And so I sat down with one of them one day, and after I explained the technology to him, he put his hand on my shoulder like this, and he said, "Son," and I'm listening, he said, "Son, it'll never happen. You'll never be able to do it. It's like trying to build a snowball in hell." So I didn't feel very good after that session, and went back to the hotel wondering whether I made the biggest mistake of my life. Thankfully, the next day I had another KOL luncheon with the chief of electrophysiology at Massachusetts General, Dr. Jeremy Ruskin, who ended up being my partner through the whole process at CryoCath, a real thought leader, guru out of Mass General and Harvard. And so I gave him the same spiel, a little bit different this time. I learned from the one the day before. And at the end of it, he put his hand on my shoulder like saying, "Oh my God, this is good. I can't handle 2 in a row." And he said, "Son, we've been waiting for this for a long time. We need a safer, better way of ablating endocardial tissue for arrhythmias. It ended up where, when we got our first PMA approval, who was sitting beside me at the panel review in Washington but Jeremy Ruskin.
Amazing. And what, that was the first time that you'd ever had a conversation with him?
Yep.
Really?
Didn't know him, he didn't know me. And it was, I guess, love at first sight.
Right. That's so
to
amazing.
speak. Even actually one day when I was in Boston strategizing with him, he actually bought me a tie, a silk tie.
Really?
I mean, usually industry buys, the direction of gifts goes the other way.
Yes.
So I was very honored by that.
Yeah, no kidding. Remarkable. So you got in. So tell me a little bit about the state of the company when you got there and the strategic direction it had and sort of maybe a few of the adventures along the way.
It had no strategic direction. It had just been formed. There were 3 engineers, graduates.
Yeah.
They were making prototype catheters with crazy glue.
Okay.
From Canadian Tire.
This is a balloon, and you're putting.
Well, the first product wasn't a balloon. It was.
Okay.
It was just a straight a point ablation catheter.
Okay.
The balloon catheter, which ultimately was the exit rationale, would have been impossible to envision at that point in time.
Oh, okay.
Impossible.
But they had a way to cool the tip. They were running liquid nitrogen or something down
compressed nitrous oxide.
Yeah.
And if you compress it to 14 atmospheres pressure, it goes down to the end of the catheter in liquid form through an injection tube.
Yeah.
And then when it's released into a vacuum at the tip, it immediately, through the pressure drop, changes phases from liquid to gas.
Right.
And that principle is called the Joule-Thompson principle, which creates very cold temperatures.
Sure. So you basically push it through a tiny orifice at the end, at the tip.
You're basically creating a little mini refrigerator at the tip of a catheter.
Remarkable. So then you have a return path for the gas inside.
And so one of the challenges was trying to develop enough data and design verification and validation data to reassure the FDA that injecting refrigerant at 14 atmospheres pressure into the left side of a beating heart was going to be safe.
No big deal.
No big deal.
I can imagine that took some doing.
I told the team, I was smart enough to listen to a couple of the KOs, and I told the team 3 months in, I said, by the time we're finished the development process, I don't want a doctor anywhere in the world to sit there and worry whether his catheter was going to blow up.
Right.
And we succeeded. To this day, people use thousands and thousands of products per week.
Yeah.
And there's not even a thought about the fact that you're injecting high-pressure refrigerants down flexible catheters.
Right. That's amazing. So let's talk a little bit about the clinical strategies. Because I know that there were some challenges. Maybe was it? Oh, you tell us the story. How did you get into your clinical trials, and what were you trying to prove?
Well, the first clinical trial was just with a straight catheter, no balloons, no fancy things at the tip, just with a solid metal tip, just to freeze tissue rather than burning it, which is what the radiofrequency ablation catheters would do.
So you're trying to find the pulmonary.
No. At the time, pulmonary vein isolation was unknown.
Oh, okay.
Okay, that only came out as a way of ablating atrial fibrillation 2 years after the company was started.
Oh, okay.
So we weren't even going to be an AF company.
Oh, okay. What was the
it was going to be point ablation of arrhythmias around the atrioventricular node.
Oh, okay.
Okay. And the benefit of cryo there is that you could do something called cryo mapping, where you could take the temperature of the tissue down, not to the supreme cold, but down far enough to see whether the electrical effect you were creating was the right one or not. And if you didn't, you could move the catheter.
Right.
And that was called cryo mapping. So that was our niche, and that was our value proposition.
Yeah.
Now, to do cryo mapping, we were very concerned about controlling temperature and everything. But to our dismay, halfway through a multi-million-dollar clinical trial after I think 90 patients out of a cohort of 225 had been treated. We got some interim data that suggested that the design wasn't creating enough cooling power at the tip inside a beating heart. Again, the concept of snowballs in hell, right?
Yes.
Because a beating heart and the hot blood in there is an extreme challenge when you're trying to freeze tissue versus burning it.
So 90 patients, and you've already spent $10 million or so on this trial.
Millions, for sure.
Yeah.
And so I had to make another gut-wrenching decision to stop the trial. And I think my salvation at the time is that I was totally transparent with the board of directors.
Yeah.
I immediately called an emergency meeting of the board.
Yeah.
I was extremely transparent of the problem, the issue, and the way we were going to correct it with a specialized task force.
Yes.
And I was bringing in experts from outside to help me and the team solve this as quickly as possible. It took about a year to solve it. We put the trial on hold. Yeah. The board was gracious and understanding and bought my plan. Yeah. And it worked out.
So what was your capital situation at the time? Did you have enough runway to be able to work through all that, or did you have
yes,
to
we
do
did.
it?
Yes, we did. We did a Series A fairly quickly after I joined. Okay, there was not very much money in the bank. Yeah. From a seed round, and basically I did a Series A that was unheard of at the time. Yeah. Which was 7 different VCs. 3 American, 1 European, and 3 Canadian. Oh my goodness, that's a lot of work. When you get 7 lawyers and 7 VCs in one room trying to agree on one term sheet. Yeah. Oh my goodness. I didn't know what I was getting into. We ended up closing that round on Christmas Eve.
Nothing like a deadline.
A deadline like, hey, it's Christmas Eve, guys. We have other things to worry about. Yeah. So we closed it on Christmas Eve at 9 o'clock. My wife and at the time I had no kids, was at a réveillon, which is a French-Canadian celebration on Christmas Eve. And I told her, go there without me, and I might see her there later. Yeah. So we closed, and the funny story is that I ended up with 7 checks in my pocket totaling $12.5 million. Yeah. And I went to the party. And I was showing everybody, look at the checks. I was the hit of the party.
I hope so. That's remarkable. So you went through, I think you said you had another clinical trial that gave you some challenges as well.
Yes, but we were able to identify the challenge and respond to it earlier and faster.
Oh, I see.
See, I think the key in, let me get philosophical and wise for a moment. Yeah. The key that I've learned from my days as an entrepreneur is that you have to create an organization that anticipates. Okay, any organization in a startup that assumes that you're going to have a problem-free development life cycle is mistaken. Right. So the key is to not sit and wait for a problem to happen, because you know it's going to happen.
Right. Sure.
You anticipate the problems, and you have potential strategies to deal with these anticipated issues if and when they surface. Right. So one of my themes now throughout the course of the rest of my career in startups is create an anticipating organization, not a trusting one.
Yeah, that's interesting. So let's talk a little bit about the relationship with strategics, because at some point you started a dialogue. And what was your strategy at that time?
Get them involved in what you're doing as early as possible.
So how did that happen in this case with CryoCath?
Well, I mean, it was a combination of a number of things, but through the KOL network that I had surrounded myself with, the advisory board, scientific advisory board members who knew all the big strategics, and through some of the American VCs on the board who knew the strategics. Yes. you just network, and so you set up meetings, and then
Yeah.
you keep them regularly appraised of it. You certainly make
Sure.
them know behind the scenes that you're not just talking to them.
Sure.
You know, a little bit of competition never hurts anybody. And
And so you were in dialogue with 2 or 3?
4 or 5.
Okay. At the time, there would have been 4 or 5 potential
4 or 5
acquirers for
typical leaders in the field.
interventional cardiology.
Boston Scientific, Medtronic, St. Jude,
Right.
J&J,
Right.
Biosense Webster.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, the
Interesting.
typical cast.
Right. So tell me the story of how you got from your point catheter to a balloon.
That's a great question. It was an iterative process of two iterations. So when Michel Hesseguer, probably the world's most famous cardiac electrophysiologist out of Bordeaux, France, when he published a landmark paper in the New England Journal of Medicine in November of 1998, I remember very well.
You remember.
Yeah, I could probably recite it to you off by my memory, because it was a game changer for the industry, because he said, hey guys, we figured out what causes atrial fibrillation.
Sure.
And it was a very unlikely etiology. So there were actually electrical triggers originating in the pulmonary veins that migrated into the atrium that caused atrial fibrillation.
Right.
We were always looking for triggers inside the heart,
Right.
but in this case, the triggers were outside the heart in the veins.
Right.
So the theory was, if you could electrically isolate by creating a ring of non-conducting tissue at each of the orifices of the 4 pulmonary veins going into the left atrium, then you could stop the triggers
Yes.
and cure arrhythmias. And lo and behold, that was the case.
Right.
So unlike radio frequency energy, where you can drag and burn, cryo sticks like a tongue on a railing in the wintertime, so we couldn't drag it.
Right.
And so making a ring of frozen tissue was too time consuming and too painful. So we actually created a long linear freezing tip
Okay,
that,
like a ring.
that had nitinol in it, and that had memory. So you inserted it through a sheath into the heart, but it had memory in it, so that when you opened it up in the heart, it looked like a pigtail.
Right.
So you could take the pigtail in, place it at each orifice, and turn on the cold. And the theory was that you would create, through one ablation, the desired effect.
Sure.
And actually, the first case, which was in London, Ontario, with Dr. George Klein, was an unbelievable success. I left the cath lab. I was at the case. I left the cath lab with my feet not touching the ground.
Amazing.
Unfortunately, the next 9 cases were failures. And then when we sat with our advisory board and understood it, we realized that all the blood going through the middle of the pigtail as the heart was beating was offsetting the cooling effect.
Oh, okay.
So we were not really creating a ring of non-conducting tissue. It was only superficially being created.
Oh,
There it is, a snowball in hell again,
Right.
right?
Oh my goodness.
So that's when we said, well, how do we deal with this hot blood? And at a brainstorming session one day with the engineers and the advisors and the KOLs, we said, why don't we stick a balloon inside the pigtail,
Right.
stop the blood flow temporarily, and let the pigtail work? And that concept started our thinking, which ultimately ended up in a balloon.
Sure.
But the technical challenges of inserting a balloon that blew up to, not blew up, but expanded to 30 millimeters, then retracting it out of that same sheath
Yes.
and creating a safe balloon environment in the left atrium was probably the biggest technical challenge that I've ever had to be part of.
Remarkable. But then you started having good clinical results.
Good clinical results. We started to gain momentum. During the whole process, the word got out that we were probably on the verge of the next solution for atrial fibrillation in the world. And that's when our bankers approached us to say, now's the time to go for an IPO.
Amazing.
And I must say that one of the most exciting and enjoyable experiences, exhausting, but enjoyable and exciting, was the IPO we did in 2000. And
which exchange did you go public on?
The Toronto Stock Exchange.
Right.
And at the time it ended up being very successful, oversubscribed. And we raised, for a Canadian medtech startup, nearly 50 million, which was pretty big at the time.
Yeah, for sure. So then, I know that company ultimately was sold to Medtronic. So how did that all happen?
So, well, I mean, we were able to get approval of the balloon catheter in Europe pretty quickly at the time.
Yeah.
We organized 20 German sites.
Yeah.
We forgot about the United States.
Yeah.
And my goal was to get 20 German sites buying the product
Yeah.
in an organized post-marketing study,
Yeah.
joining the data, and then publishing that and giving it at one of the Heart Rhythm Society meetings. That was done in 2009.
Yeah.
And within 6 months of the Germans publishing that data, we were acquired.
Oh my goodness.
And there was a bidding challenge between a number of the strategics at the time.
Right. Yeah.
So that's the story
That's
of CryoCath. It was a great experience.
And to this day, CryoCath is still in Montreal, and it's a sort of legacy that you've built.
Employs almost 750 people in Montreal, producing 3,000 to 4,000 balloon catheters a week.
Amazing. That's been
that brings me so much joy to think that we can build something up, create good quality jobs in Canada, and be distributing this technology and curing people of AF around the world, including China.
Right, remarkable.
It is.
Yeah. So let's talk about your next venture, because I know you've had a few. And so what are the circumstances that got you involved in that company?
So after the CryoCath sale, obviously I was sort of known like sort of like an electrophysiology leader.
Yeah.
And there was an AF mapping company in Ohio, the Cleveland Clinic, that was in trouble.
Right.
And so I had the venture capitalists call me up, invite me in, basically say help.
Right.
And I could see that it was really in trouble. There was no cash left.
Right.
So I negotiated a deal with, there was one VC out of Pittsburgh driving it. Negotiated deal for some bridge financing. I would participate because I could now. And within 3 years, basically turned that around.
Was the strategy obvious, or how did you figure that out?
No, it was figured out with my KOLs again. Because it was in the same field as my previous company, electrophysiology, I already had the world-class network of key opinion leaders. So I quickly brought them together when I was parachuted in, realized that we were going down the wrong path.
What was the path?
It was, they were going to find a better way to map biventricular pacing for congestive heart failure.
Right.
I knew that the real hot and sexy space right now was atrial fibrillation. Right. And I decided we were going to become a one-stop, non-invasive, bilateral mapping system to map atrial fibrillation, which had never been done before.
Got it. So it's sort of the beginning with the end in mind idea. You knew what the acquirers would be interested in, so you pivoted the company to where the market was, basically.
Well, and with the help of the KOLs, who also talk with the strategics. So, I always say the fastest way to a strategic's heart is through their KOLs.
Right. Yes, that's very true.
Because they really, these big infrastructure companies, they really rely on their key opinion leader network to decide where is the new technology, where are we heading, and what's the right thing to buy.
Remarkable. So now this was a wearable, like a vest.
A wearable, yeah, disposable 250 electrode vest that you could put on. You could actually even map the patient the day before in their room.
Yes.
Before the procedure, and then so the map would show regions where the triggers of persistent atrial fibrillation were occurring, and they would develop their ablation strategy, and then the patient, you would go in and boom, within an hour and a half, the patient was treated, and because mapping was so poor at the time, the success rates for persistent atrial fibrillation ablation, which is different than paroxysmal, which is what we dealt with CryoCath, the rates were about 40 to 50% best success rate. With our technology, which we were able to prove in a 10-site multi-center study in Europe, that the ablation rates and success rates went up to 75 to 80%. So literally doubling them with a non-invasive pre-planning mapping technology.
Remarkable. And did you have to change the technology too, or was it more market, or was it
Well, we changed it completely.
Really?
Completely, including all the software and the signal processing capabilities, because we had to pick up P waves on the body surface that were extremely weak, and we had to go through loops to get the ability to map on the body surface to that level of precision on the heart.
I can see why your engineering background allowed you to become successful in your field, because you're talking so comfortably about all the technical challenges.
Didn't hurt.
That's remarkable. Okay, and so that company...
the minute that we were able to prove this, and that was it. Medtronic again ended up being the acquirer of that technology, and I was very happy about that. I think of all the strategics in the world in the cardiovascular space, the most professional of them all is Medtronic in my mind. So I'm very happy and proud that my first two technologies ended up in the hands of the most competent, polished, and professional strategic in the world.
And what was the point you had to get it to be able to establish the value for them?
That you could show in a multi-center study, in a post-marketing multi-center study, where they're willing to pay for the product, they're showing adoption.
Oh, okay. So
because one of the key things that differentiates clinical studies, you know, preclinical or clinical studies before regulatory approval from post-marketing studies, is that in a post-marketing study, you can still get the same quality of data, but you've taken the validity of your initiative beyond the clinical acceptance phase into a quasi-commercial situation where you can demonstrate adoption at a certain price point. And those are the things that the strategics look at when they're making a determination of whether this is worth acquiring or not.
So you're on the market, but you weren't pushing sales too hard?
No, we're only concentrating on those 10 to 20 strategic.
So you had a CE mark, is that right? So you got the CE mark, you were allowed to sell in Europe, but you were really just using that as a way to be able to do post-market studies.
So I call it strategic commercialization. It's what I teach at Centech, the accelerator, where I'm an entrepreneur-in-residence now, which I'm loving. But the days of, I call it spray and pray, you know, get sales wherever you can. Those days are over. It's too costly, and it doesn't impress the strategics, which are ultimately your exit opportunity.
They know they got good salespeople. They just want to be able to...
They don't need you to show them that you can sell it. They need to see that the KOLs are adopting it in a quasi-commercial setting.
Remarkable, because I know that was also a good exit for hundreds of millions. And so that was the second company that you sold for hundreds of millions to a strategic. So it's remarkable. Okay, so there you are. You've now had a great success.
A lot less time too.
What was the total time?
5 years.
5 years. Remarkable. Okay, so there you are, king of the world. You're in Montreal, just had 2 great exits.
I came back and started thinking about starting a MedTech fund myself. You know, and because I saw the need for a dedicated venture fund in Canada for MedTech. I thought I had the credibility and the experience to maybe pull it off. But the market really wasn't ready for it yet.
Right.
The Canadian market still didn't believe that MedTech was a big enough opportunity on its own.
Right.
So I was approached at that point by the University of Sherbrooke and some early stage venture capitalists there to look at an interesting technology there called the shockwave technology, which could be generated in a very elegant, controllable fashion. And I went in there as an advisor, consultant, evaluate things, and they said, what do you think? We can make, with our technology, a smaller, cheaper lithotripsy device. And smaller, cheaper is not in my vocabulary, you know, my entrepreneurial vocabulary.
It's not enough to drive it into the market.
Not enough to drive it into the market and to be acquired by a strategic.
Yeah.
So I said, let me have a look at this. So I went back to my network again, cardiologists, cardiac surgeons, and I talked to some urologists too about this, and they go, well, yeah, it's interesting, smaller, cheaper, but what am I going to do with my $1 million machine that I just bought?
Right.
I go, oh, that's not a good thing.
Yeah.
So I saw that there was this growing awareness and opportunity for better management of calcium in the cardiovascular system. And that the interventional world was starting to realize that the real problem is calcium, not plaque. And shock waves and calcium go hand in hand, just like they did with lithotripsy and kidney stones. So I went back and to the professor and his 2 PhD students, I said, if you could convert the technology, figure out a way to deliver it down guide wires and microcatheters, and go through in a proof of concept some kind of a human plaque, we have something. And they tried, and I wouldn't give up, I wouldn't compromise. And finally, 18 months later, Martin Brouillette, my co-founder, called me up and said, we got it. So I went there in the bowels of the engineering labs at the University of Sherbrooke. They had set up an ex vivo artery full of calcium from an amputated leg of a diabetic. And they showed me with a crude prototype system that they could get through it like a hot knife through butter. So I go, that's it. Medtech, take a video of this. Next month, there's a big CTO, Chronic Total Occlusion Conference, led by Marty Leon in New York, famous cardiologist. He knew me, so we got an audience with him, showed him the video, and the rest is history.
Remarkable.
4 years later, and $40 million and 2 series financings that we're well on track to having a very successful new technology.
Remarkable. So you once again pivoted the whole company in a direction.
Well, it wasn't even a company. I pivoted a professor and 2 PhD students. So it was hard to pivot, 3 academics without having the clout of being the CEO and having money and capitalists. But they were smart enough to listen and go after it. And 18 months later, so it was
remarkable. So do you have any sort of broader insights you'd like to talk about, sort of advice that you give to entrepreneurs?
Yes. And so obviously as the Entrepreneur-in-Residence at Centech, which is the accelerator that I lead in MedTech and in Montreal, one of the things there's a couple of things that I preach. Number one is don't rush to sales.
Interesting.
Okay, don't succumb to the pressures of less than smart investors who only think that sales are a validation of your technology, which is totally wrong. The second point is that because often I've actually had to save one company that rushed their alpha product into the market, sold 20 systems to the first 20 guys that showed up. They weren't ready, the technology wasn't ready, and it was a mess. So I was parachuted in to clean it up. So I don't want to ever see that happen to one of my companies.
Right.
And so don't rush to sales. Think strategically when you do get into sales. Mm-hmm. And don't cut corners.
Right. Any parting words you'd like to share with our audience?
No, I think I just want to compliment you on the fact that you're doing these series. I think it's great for the Canadian medtech industry and for the medtech industry as a whole.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.